Hello and welcome to another episode of Intentionally Act Live. This is your host, Enrico E. Manalo. I am joined by my very, very special guest today, Tamim Ansary. He has written a really remarkable book called The Invention of Yesterday, a 50,000 year history of human culture, conflict, and connection. Tamim kind of describes himself as something of a drifter, having drifted from Kabul through the American counterculture, the Asia Foundation as the editor of a biweekly publication, textbook publishing, writing nonfiction books for children, a column on Encarta.com, running the San Francisco Writers Workshop, and 6 books not specifically aimed at children. Tamim, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Interesting bio that you just laid out there. I'm like, whoa, I did drift around a little bit, didn't I?
Well, I think you wrote most of it. I mean, I borrowed a lot of it from your website and other places. So if it's interesting to you, I mean, it's definitely interesting to me. Well, how are you? Like, what have you been up to lately?
Well, lately I've really been thinking a lot about, I've been writing several books, working on several books. I've been working on I thought I was working on a book about conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
But really, it turns out I'm writing a book about how narrative operates in human society and how it, how it manifests in history, and just how narratives are what we live in, and how they can go wrong and how they could go right. So that's what I've been thinking about.
That's amazing. I mean, I remember one of the first conversations that you and I had, you said something that really kind of blew my mind. Like you were talking about memoir and how that's personal history, and how all those individual memoirs weave into what we think of as history.
Yeah.
And it's obvious now that you've laid it out for me that way, but I had just never thought about it that way. And I think part of what was in the way of me realizing that for myself is I had that connotation of history that I picked up in school, right?
Wow.
History was opening that ancient textbook, that really musty textbook with outdated pictures. And at some point, it could also function as a pillow. But in reading your book, that's like, there's a page turner, my background is in conflict resolution. So immediately the title was sucking me in. And, just the way that book began, like I knew that I wasn't going to be able to put it down. So I guess my first question for you is, how did you fall in love with what you do? I mean, in my mind, what you do is you're a writer, but you're also a historian. Is that correct?
That's correct. And, when I think about what I've written, I feel like everything I've written is in some way about history, and in some way it's memoir. And then in some way, all of it is related to this philosophical thing I'm grappling with. And, from the history point of view, I would say I fell in love with history, if that's what you want to call it, when I was a little kid. And a historian named Arnold Toynbee came through our little town in Afghanistan, and someone said, "Oh, this little boy likes history," So I sat down with Arnold Toynbee, and he gave me a book called "The Story of Mankind" by Henrik Willem van Loon. It's a Dutch historian, and it was just told as a story. And the thing that got to me was the story. He said mankind, I would say humankind. And it made me go, wait, is there one story that is the story of all of us?
Yeah.
What is that story? If that, and then the further, conflagration of excitement of, if there is a story of all of us, I'm in that story.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a character in that story. What is that story? And I think in some way that has remained sort of the template of how my model of what the world is. It's like there is some sense in which, okay, there's a material world, there's mountains, there's rivers and stuff, but we don't really live directly in some material reality. We live in a social landscape that we are constructing with the people we're communicating with.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I have long been fascinated by and puzzled by the riddle of how is it that I am an individual person looking at the world, and the world is social reality looking at me, and I'm a participant in making social reality what it is.
Yeah.
And social reality has made me from the start and is continuing to make me. So that interaction is basically what has just grabbed me, and I keep thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the things that I read in the opening pages of The Invention of Yesterday was the Great Wall of China going up has something to do with the Roman Empire coming down. And there, you're talking about communication of events, but throughout your work, there's this theme not only of communication but intercommunication. So I wonder if you can kind of parse for our audience what that difference is, because I think it is subtle, but it's very important.
Well, I think of, first of all, let me back up a little bit and say this. Uh, what I'm coming to think about is that what we live in as human beings are networks of relationships.
Yes.
And I've come to find that the word networks works better for me than the word groups, because groups has a connotation of having a skin, and you're inside. Everything that's inside the group is part of the group, and then there's a border, and then everything that's outside the group is just otherness.
Mm-hmm.
Social reality is not really like that. It's like at the edges of every group, people are relating with others that are not part of the group, but so networks kind of fade into one another.
Yeah.
And so if you think about something like, well, let's say Chinese civilization or the Chinese world, there's no place you can come to and say, okay, that's the end of China, and now begins the Central Asian steppes.
Yeah.
There's relationships that cross all borders.
Mm-hmm.
And wherever there's a relationship, there's an interaction. It's like people are talking to one another, and it's necessary for them to find some way to intercommunicate so that they can operate as parts of some single social event.
Yeah.
And that's happening all over the world. So any place this Great Wall of China thing, in the abstract, let's just say it this way. Everybody along the borders of China were interacting with people that were on the other side, and there was a relationship there. And those people on the other side had relationships with people further into what the Chinese would have called the world of the unknown. But for them, it wasn't the unknown, it was where they lived. And when you go along the spectrum there, you get to Rome, you get to Britain, wherever people are meeting one another. And then, the further thing is the fundamental circuitry or blood or lymphatic fluid or whatever you might say that binds people together is their intercommunication, and I would call it the story they're telling.
Yeah.
And where you have people who are intercommunicating prolifically, it's like I have a connection with you, and you two have a connection with each other, and they have two connections with these people, and this is a place where this web of relationships that's all of humanity has thickened into an area where there's a lot of small circuitry interconnections. And in any such area, the stories anybody tells will circulate through this network and eventually come back. And when they come back, they've changed. Because everybody who tells a story adds to it or subtracts to it to make it the best story they can, or the most correct story, the most accurate story they can. And so all of us are living in sort of a lymphatic fluid of narratives reality.
Yeah.
Is what we're creating together without explicitly knowing we're doing it. All we're doing is just telling other people what we think and what we know.
I mean, I love that framing. In my own background, we talk about, groups a lot. And what we know from the research is even the suggestion of another group is enough to motivate competition and often conflict. And how we kind of get around that is by relating to one another on that human level. And a huge pillar of that is allowing people to tell not only their side of the story, but the entirety of what they think the story is.
Yeah.
Right. And in that way, we get to see where there is real alignment, where there's commonality. And often by letting people communicate with one another in this very kind of structured way, we can kind of move past the messiness, you know? And so with this idea of that density of connections, like I'm reminded of a knot, right? A knot is something that it's connected, but you can't quite understand how. And so you kind of try to struggle out of it, and it just kind of makes it worse. But if you kind of twist the strands a bit and back it up a little bit, it often kind of resolves itself. And it's so hard to see that once you're kind of entangled in the whole thing.
Right. And that knot thing brings up the idea that the more knotted a web of interrelationships becomes, the more it's impervious to outside influences, the more it's inward looking and just involved with itself. And part of the impulse or the force that knots up relationships and gets some number of people to think of themselves as a self and there's an other out there, it has to do with, the people that you're with and that you interact with are involved in a common enterprise to wrest from the environment what we need and to hold off whatever is going to possibly harm us out there. And when we feel like, when it comes into our awareness that, hey, there might not be enough for everyone.
Yeah.
That's when people start saying, well, who are we not going to share with?
Yeah, right.
And, I feel like these days there's anxiety about how there might not be enough for everyone soon.
Oh, yeah.
When you get the Colorado River is running dry and Portland is suffering from 114-degree heat and a building collapses in Miami, possibly because of ocean salt spray or whatever, people are worried. There's an anxiety there that's not particular to any particular thing. It's not like if I feel a lump in my chest, that's a particular thing. I'm worried. Maybe I can't. But this is it's sort of like a diffuse anxiety that's everywhere.
Yeah. So kind of what people might describe as a general malaise or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, the positive side of that is that it's frightening to think that the challenges besetting us from the environment are global, which makes it feel like, I'm just one little guy. And the problems are global. But the problems are being global means all of humanity has to tackle this as if we're all part of us.
As if, right?
Yeah.
I guess that's one thing that's on my mind is how can we get good or come to an understanding of how to better intercommunicate with one another, especially when we do experience the world kind of as a singular person, and you got your own troubles, you got a toothache, you got to take care of the car, the dog needs walking. How do you get your head out of someplace dark into someplace lighter?
Well, we're coming back to narrative now. And I think, one of the things that's happening in the U.S. now is that submerged narratives are coming up and saying, hey, this is a story that's actually been happening and no one's been paying attention.
Right. This whole time.
Yeah, this whole time it's been happening. And I look at, the story of African Americans in America.
Yeah.
And I'm recognizing in myself, when I came here in 1964,
Mhm.
there was a world here that already existed. It's like I wasn't creating it was here. And, I knew that there was ghettos and those were sort of risky places. You didn't want to go there.
Sure.
And, the people in ghettos tended to all be dark-skinned people. So and I also knew that there had been slavery at one point.
At some point, yeah.
And then, fortunately, that was solved because there was a civil war and that was made illegal. So that's gone. No more of that. Uh, so in the mainstream story of America, all of that's something that happened long ago, has ended. But if your experience is in the stream of narrative that's being an African American in America, it actually never ended.
Yeah.
It's still happening. It's just a different stage of that story.
Mm-hmm.
But it has not been previously in the mainstream public awareness. So now when it comes into the public awareness, there's a lot of resistance, like, stop telling that story.
Right.
Don't tell it. That makes us look bad.
They already said, and they all lived happily ever after. Didn't you read that part?
Right. And that they all lived happily ever after also then means you have to find an explanation for why some people are really poor, and some people are not, and that it's not random somehow.
Yeah, somehow.
I'm
reminded of there's this comedian, Bill Burr, and he has this bit. What did you think they thought? And he was responding to I think at the time there was a show called Duck Dynasty, and this man said some really outdated, very racist stuff. And this comedian was making the point that guy was pretty elderly at that point. And the people that raised him were of the generation that probably completed the Indian Wars. Right. So it's not like his point was like, for the time, maybe he was a progressive guy, but, at some point he just kind of didn't keep up with everything. And, the context that he grew from was really informing those opinions. And it wasn't like he was absolving this guy of anything, but he was really just kind of making the case that this could happen to any of us if we're not paying attention to the story. Like, certainly I've turned on the TV, watched Netflix, been watching a series, kind of zoned out for a couple episodes, come back, and I just have no idea, no context for what's happening. And that can very easily happen to anybody, and it does all the time.
Right. And the thing about a narrative is it has a single wholeness as it unfolds through time chronologically. So for any person, they're part of a timeline. They're part of a story that's started in the past and is going towards the future, and they're in a chapter of it now. And in order to build a more sort of inclusive, bigger society, we have to find the story that we're all in a chapter of now.
Yeah.
That's that's kind of what my impulse has been in writing history is, certainly the invention of yesterday. But before that, I wrote a history called Destiny Disrupted, a history of the world through Islamic eyes.
Yeah.
And, the point of departure there was we say history of the world, but we're really saying the history of the whole world from where we're standing. It's like, how did we get to here where we are today? And so there's always going to be a tendency for that to be somebody centric. And what got me started on trying to write, and writing Invention of Yesterday, I did write it. I didn't just try. I wrote it and we published it. But I still say try because this project of finding the single human story, sort of like that's the prelude to trying to have a global consciousness. That's not I didn't lay that away and it's done and now it's finished.
Right.
That's a project that we're ongoingly trying to craft. But what did consume me there was, how can you find a story that includes that part of the part of the plot. Everybody's a character in this plot. Let's find that story. That's
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that's on my mind as we're talking here is, earlier I was saying each of us has our own struggles and things like that. As Americans, we often we work a lot, and this goes very deep actually. So I think I introduced you as an author, right? So when we're in a social context, we often talk about what we do instead of who we are as people, which is very weird when you start to think about it, right? It's like identifying different parts of a machine rather than, oh, these are my individual characteristics. This is, what my family has been all about. Like, this is how I think about things. And I have this sense that in kind of thinking about things in this way, it is kind of hard for us to raise our heads above the hedge to take a look at what's around. So we might be participating in the story, but we don't see the other streams, other stories that are happening at the same time. So I wonder if you have some insight on how we can start to do that.
No. But there's several things that sprang into my mind, and one of it goes back to something we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
There was that comedian from the past who, in Dynasty or something, made jokes that we look back at that now and we go, what was wrong with that guy?
Right.
One thing we have to be careful about is the bias about the present. We have a feeling, we live in a feeling that we're finally living in the truth that has been discovered. Mm-hmm. And there will be a day when people look back at what we're talking about right here, any place, and go, how could they think that? What is wrong with them?
It's true.
And in one context, when I brought it up, somebody said, give me an example. What is going to seem completely wrong in the future that seems completely right today? And I'm like, no, I'm not playing that game. Of course I don't know.
Yeah.
If I say this is going to seem wrong someday, I will be saying, I think it's wrong now. And I don't, the things I think are right seem right to me. So there's that. But, then I think about another, and this gets, I'll be personal in this anecdote. Like I say, memoir and history are related. So I'm thinking about the fact that my life has gone through stages, and I've been I lived in Portland once, and then I came here, and now who knows what, in Afghanistan, blah, 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 all that drifting that you talked about. So there's a narrative line there. Mm-hmm. And at each of these places where I was, I had a life, and there were other people in that life. So in some cases, a girlfriend, let's say.
Okay, let's say that.
All right, so I think back to a moment in the past with somebody that was dear to me then, and I realized that moment in the past exists in both of our life strands, but in her life strand, it's part of a narrative that has other things that happened into it. She came from someplace, she passed through that moment, and she was going someplace. I came from someplace, passed through that moment, and I'm going someplace. When we look back, we don't see the same moment.
Right. Yeah.
That moment doesn't exist in the present reality. It is, this is a long way of saying I don't have an answer to your question.
That's fine.
But the other point that I'd like to enlarge upon is that we have intensified or accelerated our interconnectivity globally in a mechanical sense. So it's
Yes.
possible now for anybody to have a interaction, communicative interaction with anybody else, any place on earth. That's the mechanical thing.
Mm.
What isn't possible is for anybody to communicate back and forth meanings. And
Mm.
meanings are not messages. You
Right.
know, a message is from the point of view of technology, it's a quantity of data.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the quotes that I pulled from your book today, I guess I'll just share it if you don't mind.
No, no.
Is we may never have a world we all share peacefully, but we won't ever have it if we don't build it. The goal is not for all of us to become just the same, nor to educate them so they can join with us, nor to become just like them so we can join their world. The goal is for all of us to find our way around the world with the same map. Only then will all discussions make sense. Only then will all conversations be possible. I love that. I absolutely love that. And I'm just kind of wondering if you have some thoughts about how we can start to move in that direction. Because you say we have this mechanical kind of capacity, but it's a hard thing to become familiar with one another's frames of reference, to understand the symbols, the analogies that we're using. And I think a lot of times when many cultures and narratives come together, people kind of get confused, and that can be where a lot of conflict comes in. So I know, for example, with some of our clients who might be white people, their defenses are high, right? They're saying like, "Well, I'm not a racist." Like that's part of their personal story. Like I'm a good person. I'm not a racist, but by dint of the things that they're doing in their everyday lives, they're unknowingly kind of impacting and harming other people. And it's hard for them to, we talk about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, but I don't know about you, Tamim. I wear a size 11. I don't know if we have the same size feet. It might be very tough for me to squeeze into your shoes.
Well, there's two things that come up there. One is that the word racist is so personal. It does mean to me, a racist is a bad person.
Yes, for me too.
So when the conversation is about a system, or even system is a little bit too abstract. We have a structure of society that we've inherited from history
Mhm.
that is not fair.
No.
So we're all in that structure. We could start to undertake to fix it. And I think the trouble is that the word racist is like something that has, B.F. Skinner said punishment doesn't work for learning because punishment doesn't individuate the response. It messes up all responses. So when you drop racist in the middle of a conversation about systemic racism, exactly what happens, what happens is exactly what you just said. Then people start fighting about it and saying, I'm not a bad person.
Right.
But if we could, let me step out to say the other thing that I think is a positive possibility.
Sure.
I think that the unraveling of the social fabric in the United States, which is underway, and I think nobody can avoid noticing that this is happening.
Mm.
It might be that it's an inevitable part of moving from one global narrative to another one. You have to unravel the old one and then be able to see how the strands can be put together to ravel, so to speak, a new one, to weave together a new big model of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that happens, that no person can actually do that thing.
Right.
Person can only do what they can do.
Mm-hmm.
They can only And the process of having that new paradigmatic global narrative come into being is a process that from the ground level just looks like me arguing with you, with arguing with that person. It may be that a new paradigm is forming.
Yeah.
We don't see it until it's here.
Yeah. Till it's really smacking us in the face.
It might be smacking us in the face, but what we can do is keep thinking from a larger perspective. Just try to rise above and see where everybody's coming from. How did everybody get here?
Yeah.
Not how did we get here, because we don't have a we yet. How did everybody get here?
That's a good point. I mean, I've often kind of, in thinking about the U.S., and we abbreviate it as the capital U, the capital S, which is us, right?
Yeah.
But somehow it's hard for us to grasp that. Like, yeah, USA, it's them. They're over there. These states, we see the divisions, right? We don't see the connection, and it also strikes me that in the stories that our own personal narratives, the stories that we grow up on, fairy tales, comic books, these kinds of things, these are often stories about who is good and who is bad. But the narrative that seems to be emerging for me is this is who I am as a human. This is who we are as humans. And as we know, humans are not black or white. They are not good or bad. Even the most moral, the paragon that we hold up as our exemplar is going to have bad days, and even the worst bad guy might I don't know, do something kind or nice for somebody at some point in their lives. And I do think it's very hard for us to grasp that, like to really internalize it. So we often get that up here, but when we're under stress, what comes out of here is you're good, you're bad, this is right, that's wrong.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about something that bothered me a year or two ago. I used to run this group called the San Francisco Writers Workshop.
Yeah.
And the San Francisco Writers Workshop had one very simple rule, or a couple of very simple rules. Anybody could come and sit down and get on a list to read what they'd written. That was the first thing. And the second thing was nobody could read more than 6 pages.
And, a good rule.
And the third thing was, once the person had read, they could not speak. Only the people giving feedback could speak. And this was like a key element of how that workshop worked. But the people who took over after me, there was a foursome, it was like a gang of four or a committee, a Politburo took over. And this system began to break down a little bit, because some people came and read and they would argue when feedback started.
Yeah.
And in one case, the person who argued was African American.
Okay.
So the person who was leading the group then said, no, you can't do that. And then you have to shut up, let the feedback go forward. And then that resulted in turmoil. And they came to me to ask for advice because they fell out amongst each other. And one of those workshop leaders said the other one was a racist.
Okay.
And so when the case was laid before me, of course, I'm no longer part of it. So I was like, don't ask me. But the thing that was difficult about it was that a person who was giving feedback was saying things that, come on, you can't just listen to that. That person was saying things that were, I can see why the writer was saying, I can't let that go. I'm going to speak here. You're wrong. But the rules of the group were, you can't do that. So which one, which principle wins out in that case? And I think, it's like, that's like a one example. that's a wider sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not able to. I was like, I'm glad I don't run this group anymore.
That sounds like a hard one. I mean,
Yeah,
I mentioned to you previously that my undergrad degree was in creative writing. I am very familiar with that process that you were talking about.
yeah,
And for our audience, it can be absolutely brutal, right?
yeah.
So in an academic setting, it's your entire class taking this thing that you've labored over, just tearing it to pieces, right?
Yeah.
Viciously often because they want to be the best. And then when you're like a quivering mass of goo, that's when your professor piles on with their professional opinion and reduces you to cinders. And then you have to go home and rebuild it. And often at your own expense, have to print out copies for everybody the next week so that they can do it again.
Yeah.
Um, and like stark as that sounds, I think it can be really great because along the way you do kind of develop a sense of the feedback that you want to listen to and feedback that you can more easily tune out. However, that said, for Black and brown people, there are often kind of layers of the human experience that if you're not one of those people, then you might not be privy to. You might not be privy to the bias that you are bringing into that into that situation. So far from being objective, while it might seem objective to some, it can actually be quite personal. And that just kind of reminds me again, like when we don't know what's going on with one another, then it's really hard to understand why we react in certain ways.
Yeah.
And, it is kind of ironic that one reaction often provokes another, and then you get a chain reaction, which,
Yeah.
who knows what can happen after that.
But the one thing you can say is that if it's possible to create contexts in which conversation happens, even when there's conflict, it's like we don't want to have arrange it so that there will not be any conversation that's uncomfortable for anyone participating.
Right.
That can't go anywhere.
Yeah.
The conversations have to happen in which people who are uncomfortable with each other's opinions have to interact and be able to. And sometimes that's not going to be very profitable interaction. There's going to be fighting and kicking.
Yeah. Certainly. And to the point, to something you said in your story, I think it is, and this is me drawing from my own experience. I learned I'm from New Hampshire originally, which is a very white state. There are not a whole lot of people that look like me while I was growing up. And I learned very quickly that if I would say something to the effect that, or even just the implication that what I was experiencing was racism, then I could, if I were not my best self, I could manipulate that. And it was like a kind of a big get out of jail free card sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think for not everybody, of course, but for some people, it's a very easy defense to bring to bear, right? So, there's these things that you're saying about me or my work, and that's making me uncomfortable and feeling defensive. And humans, we often just psychologically we want to protect ourselves, right? And
Sure.
so we will bring up that easy nuclear option sometimes when it's not appropriate. And I think that's hard for people to navigate as well, because for me, I'm somebody who actually went to school. I learned about racism. I learned about conflict resolution, but I'm very sure that is not the experience of the vast majority of people. In fact, a friend of mine was kind of joking around when I was in grad school, and he was saying like, "Well, Rico, are you just going to keep collecting obscure degrees?" And it's like, well, maybe I am, but I just think it's so hard for us to navigate one another's stories because nobody really teaches us how to.
Yeah.
I don't recall ever being sat down by a teacher and saying, "Okay, well, this is where this perspective is coming from, and this is why they think that way, and that's rooted in this culture and that all takes a lot of time and a lot of thought."
Yeah. You know, the thing is, culture is like language.
Mm.
Culture is a single whole thing somehow. And when you're part of a culture, you you don't know the trillions of things that are all coherently part of culture.
Right.
I feel like because I was born in this peculiar situation. My mother was an American, the first one ever to marry an Afghan, go live in that country. My father was an Afghan. I grew up in Afghanistan, and I was completely straddling this fault in the earth. So my experience has included a lot of being with just a bunch of other Afghans and being with just another bunch of Americans.
Yeah.
And I've been able to experience that when you move from one context to another, you change. Myself changes. I become that other self, the one that exists in the Afghan world. And when I come into an American context, then I'm just a whole other guy. And what it is that makes me feel this way or that way, I wouldn't be able to list it. It's just
Right.
it's beyond that. It's very global and subtle. Where they overlap, there's going to be confusion, and things are not going to make sense, and things that are funny in one culture are not funny in another. I remember when, and we don't have to even go to people making fun of people. When when the Afghan Holocaust happened and refugees started coming out, there was some of my friends were people who had just come out, and they were in Berkeley and stuff. And a guy said to me, he said, "Explain something to me. Why is Woody Allen considered funny?"
How did you respond?
I was like, well, he makes me laugh. This is before anything else. It was way long ago. He makes me laugh, but the idea that somebody who puts on being nerdy and incompetent and unable to succeed in romance, that could be funny. I said, "What do you think is funny?" He said, "Oh, well, once a whole bunch of us were in a pool, and one of our friends was in the middle of the pool, and he kept trying to get out. And we ran around the pool and just wouldn't let him. We laughed so hard."
That seems mildly terrifying, actually.
Yeah, it's like, how is that funny? So culture is like that, and then where culture, I think I might have told you this before when we were speaking, the lead up to this conversation, but again, now I accumulated quite a tribe of relatives in Little Cobble in Fremont area, and at some point, once in a while they say, "Come on over, we're having a big something or other, some family something or other." And on one of these occasions, they wanted me to come on a certain Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I didn't really want to. And the reason was, it was Super Bowl Sunday. I mean, come on, guys. This is like a big American holiday. And it wasn't just any Super Bowl Sunday. It was the Super Bowl in which Joe Montana faced off against John Elway.
Okay,
It was like, but, to say to the family, "No, I'm not going to come to you guys because I want to see who wins the football game." So, but I said, okay, I'll come. So I went to my relative's house, and everybody was all prepped to watch the game. They were all football fans. And the thing that was most striking was, there's probably 20 people, 30 people in the house. And there was a big screen TV, and the chairs that were lined up closest to the TV screen were all older women.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And they were all primly sitting there waiting for the game to start. And the game started, and they were all watching. And I watched this game for a while, and one of my cousins was sitting next to me, and I was thinking, passing down or running down. It's 3rd and 4. They have this many, and then we're here on the field. And I was thinking, I'm seeing something here that these guys are not seeing. They're just seeing people crashing together and hitting each other.
Yeah.
Um, and at that moment, my cousin said to me, you know, football is really just chess. That's what it is. It's just chess.
Okay.
And I'm like, holy shit, this guy is seeing the same game I'm seeing.
Yeah.
We are in the same space, and we're not in America.
Right.
We're not in Afghanistan. We're in some other space.
Mm.
And that space is forming.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't fully formed yet.
Yeah.
But it's a place we can all live in where we can understand similarly elements of Afghan culture, elements of American culture, elements of this. We're putting something together here. Mm-hmm. Now, I thought that was a good thing. And also I thought that's a thing that happens slowly, bit by bit, strand by strand, wherever two cultures overlap. This is going to start to happen.
Yeah.
But it's also the case that my relatives who came from Afghanistan as refugees after the Soviet invasion and grew up here, I'm talking about the little kids, it's like they came here, their parents had suffered an epic catastrophe. They had a story to tell that, you're not going to hear very many places. Many of them put in prison, tortured, they got out to get across the river and their kids, now they were safe. They were in a place, they had jobs, they had money, and the kids were going to school. And the kids were also living a story, and a story that I could understand that story. That story is heartbreaking too. Just being the outsider, and especially like in those years after the first Iraq War, and then, leading up to 9/11, especially after 9/11, right. You're part of this. You go to school and you're that guy, and on top of it all, within their family structure, it's like, what are you complaining about?
Oh, right, yeah.
People are laughing at you in high school. Grow up. We got tortured. We got killed. Your cousin so and so. So that's a very difficult situation to form a self in that context. Sure. And when I came to America, I came from Afghanistan in '64. Afghanistan was at peace, and I was a scion, SC, however it's pronounced, the one of the children of a family that was eminent in Afghanistan. We were poets and mystics. A long time back, and on top of that, I was from Afghanistan. And when you come to America and you have a sense of yourself as an Afghan, back then for me, you do not think that there's anything inferior about you. You do not think you have anything to make excuses of. The Afghans are the bravest, best, most noble people in the world. And I'm one of them. And now, after all the history that's happened, I find that young Afghans who grew up here, they have a sense of shame about being Afghans that's heartbreaking. Yeah. And it's unnecessary. And I told a story in one talk that I gave about, I didn't tell a story. I gave some talk about Afghanistan. I showed nomads and their tents and stuff, which was very much a part of life when I was growing up there. And a young Afghan wrote to me and said, "Why did you do that? We're not a nation of herders, and we don't live in tents. And you made us seem like, primitive people that didn't know anything. And we built the Taj Mahal. We had science before the West had." Right. No, you didn't. And it's unseemly to look for your sense of pride in yourself by making claims that are trying to grab something from the dominant culture. Yeah. Because what struck me was there was a friend of mine, an American guy, who went to Afghanistan during the war, and he was taking United Nations Food Supplies and Medicine in, and they ended up in some village caught in a blizzard or something, and it was just a little village that was very poor. And those guys just did not hesitate to bring them in, and they were the guests, and they got fed before anybody else in the village.
Mm.
People took care of them. And you know something? That's an Afghan thing.
Yeah.
And it is an essence of being Afghan, to be that guy, to be that village, to be that guy, those people. And to look down on that and say, you know, I'm not those villagers that
Right.
don't.
Those backwards
No,
people.
there is something incredibly spiritually noble about that village and the culture that it's part of. So this is part of like building a world culture. You know, appreciate all the different ways that culture has to do good things.
You know, when I was growing up, I remember I was really having a hard time because my parents, they really wanted me to take my education seriously. And I recall that some of my classmates were being paid by their parents actually to get good grades. And so, yeah, so I was, you know, it was a conversation in the car, and I was talking to my dad, and I was asking why he was treating me differently than I was seeing my friends being treated.
Yeah.
And, you know, he wasn't exactly angry with me, but I guess it was some kind of exasperation. But what he said has stuck with me like for 30 plus years. And it's because I don't want you to grow up like them. Right. And it took me a long time to realize that what he was saying is that, you know, he didn't want me to be assimilated into this dominant culture such that I lost some of what he and my mom had really fought to give me, which is like this sense of who I was, this sense of pride in our culture, of connection to that culture, while also being connected to our culture. And I feel like this is a real fear for a lot of immigrant families, because well, without trying to take away from American culture, assimilation has a way of making things generic, of flattening things. And I don't think that's what we need if we really want to be able to see one another as fully human, right? Because it's a shortcut, right? It's, oh, you're just some guy. You're just like me. But when the reality is, you're not just some guy. You're not just like me. And that's why it would be valuable for us to have a relationship in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. There's something important that is in there, that what you just said, you know, and there's a fear. You know, the word assimilation is one word, but the word intermingling is another word. You know, that's not quite the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that the fear of the flattening effects of assimilation has produced a value that is not productive.
Yeah.
And that's a value that says everybody should be part of their own culture and separate from other cultures, and you know, don't let, if you were Filipino, don't cook Vietnamese food because you're not Vietnamese. You know, that's not your place to cook that food.
How dare you?
Yeah, how dare you? And if you're white, don't you be playing blues. That's, you know,
right. You're not sad enough.
Yeah, you're not sad enough, or all these various kinds of things. And the thing is, the flattening effect of assimilation is something that should be concerning, because what we want is not some single culture. You know, what we want is like an organism. You know, a single culture would be like trying to become a healthy person by having the entire body just be undifferentiated similar cells. Whoa.
That's a big amoeba.
Right. No, it's like, I think our success as a species comes in part from our having many cultural ways of looking at the world, because we don't know what's really out there.
Yeah,
you know,
really
culture is our way of saying what's out there, and we need to be having many different ways to see reality, but we also have to have some way to talk to each other about what we see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we're talking about now is kind of reminding me of another quote from your book that I'd like to share just before we start to close out here. And that is up here. But there is a distinction to be made between tools and machines. The line may be murky, but it's there. Think of it this way: tools help us humans do stuff, machines do stuff, and we humans help them do it by shoveling coal into their bellies, by replacing their worn out parts when necessary, by feeding lumber into their saw teeth, whatever they need. And so, one reason why that kind of came to mind is, as a teenager, I really listened a lot to that band Rage Against the machine being the government. But increasingly, I kind of see a dominant culture as a machine. It's not a humanizing experience, right?
Yeah.
And the more tools that we have to be talking to each other and really understanding where one another are coming from, well, it's artisans the tool users who make these beautiful, wonderful expressions of culture, of humanity. Machines, they create cool, convenient stuff like this pen, but I'm not gonna gift this someday solemnly to my grandchildren and say, like it was made by such and such. It's a totally different thing.
No.
And that passage of your book just keeps sticking with me, because I think in our society we often treat things mechanistically, and that helps to divorce us from the real visceral humanity of one another's experiences. And I do think that we are the poorer for it.
Yes, I think so. The machine thing, there's one more thing to say about it.
Please.
That where machines have come now for us, and by machines I mean, now I'm talking about digital devices and the algorithm.
Right.
And it has been inevitably the case that to find your market more, you have to individuate the desires of each potential consumer and find out exactly what they want and give them that. And that'll help you grow your business. But the result is that, each person who goes to Amazon to look for books sees a bookstore nobody else has ever been in or ever will be.
Yeah.
If you ask for information from Google, you see a constellation of data that nobody else sees, just you. And that has, it seems to me, possibly implies that digital technology, one of its effects now, is to make each of us live in a solitary confinement in a cell that feeds us things to keep us happy. And that doesn't seem like a good thing.
No, and I mean, one of the things that it feeds us sometimes is outrage, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time here. So the last question I'll ask you, and I frame it this way, but you don't have to answer in 30 seconds or less. But the question is, in 30 seconds or less, what would you love to see come out of your work?
I would like to see the further development of intercommunication among various cultures on the planet that takes account of the imperialistic project that we're coming out of now, so that we can look ahead and see where we could go that's better than where we've been.
That's a great answer. For me, I've become a huge fan of your work. And one of the things that really strikes me is, while yes, racism is a very pressing issue in our workplaces and in our society, if we don't take the time to understand that that also exists in a context, that that's also a story within a larger story, then ultimately we're missing the point, because it's not just about Americans, it's about how Americans exist in the rest of the world as well, and how we all get along with one another. In any event, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on our show. Thank you so much for responding to my initial email and getting on the phone with me. And I'm just so happy that we got to spend some time together. In any case,
Thank you.
Oh, great. I'm so glad to hear that. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. This is Enrico E. Manalo with my guest, Tamim Ansary. Till next time. Bye.